All right, guys, so today we're going to be talking about React component lifecycles. This is something that we've introduced ahead of time with the new site challenge. We're going to kind of understand this concept a little better. It's definitely important to really understand why we use components and how we can kind of interact with them at different points within their lifecycle. All right, so to first understand the React component lifecycle, we want to understand a human lifecycle. So if you think about a human lifecycle, there are, four main, times that we kind of deal with. One is conception. So conception, we're not going to cover that today. That's going to be a biology 101 topic. So if you have questions about that, that'll be probably for your biology teacher. But we all, as humans, go through a birth process where we are born into the world, and we might say hello world when we enter into the world. We all go through aging. So each year we celebrate a birthday. And aging is not like a step function. It's gradual. Like we're aging at the second, like every second we're aging. But aging is something we go through, and then ultimately, unfortunately, we're all going to pass away one day, and that's generally what the human life cycle looks like. Again, there's a lot more to the human life cycle, but those are the main pillars that we kind of can bookmark for anyone's life cycle. So going off of the human life cycle, we're going to get talking about the React component life cycle. Luckily, it's very similar in terms of the stages that a React component will go through. So conception, birth, aging, and death, we have similar points within a React component. So for a React component, we have conception, which is when the component is like initially created. Birth is actually when the component gets added to your screen. So when it's rendered to your screen, that's effectively when it's like kind of birthed into the world. So your screen, you can imagine, is the world where you can actually see it. So there's a point of conception before it's actually thrown onto the screen. Your component will go through some aging, and in this case, aging will just be updating. So we talked about, state values can update, props can update, and this will cause kind of a re-render for your component. And finally, as with humans, your React component will go through go through a death stage where the component be removed from the DOM. So it'll be no longer visible on your screen when it's taken off the DOM. So going off of these stages, we have specific methods within class-based components that can kind of capture a certain point in time for us to do certain things with our components. Now, the thing I want to stress right now is we're going to be talking about class-based components initially, because we think it's much more simpler to understand how to work with these lifecycle methods or these lifecycle stages using class-based components, because there are specific methods where you can kind of capture these points in a lifecycle and then do whatever you need to do. With functional-based components, which we are focusing on for the most part, there's still all this capability, but it's kind of a little less discrete, as in it's not divided up as discretely as it is with class-based components. All right, so again, the methods we're going to talk about are specific to class-based components. So for React components, there are certain methods that you can implement so that React will automatically call them and will do what you want to do at that point in time. So in terms of conception, that is when a constructor is called in your class-based component. So if you remember, constructors are very similar to that init method in Python classes. For JavaScript classes, we have a constructor where you can do any general initialization that you need to do for your component. For the most part, you're not going to have to use a constructor. There might be certain use cases where you might need to do something right off the bat before like even component did mount gets called. But from my experience, the constructor isn't heavily used in React components. But know that you do have access to it. Again, if you need to do something, you're going to implement a constructor in your class-based component and do whatever logic you need to do there. For post-birth, we have a method called component did mount. So after your component is rendered to the DOM for the first time, component did mount will be called, and you can do whatever logic you need to do. Also with aging or updating in this case, when an update happens, component did update will get called, and then before your component dies, so this is kind of neat. Like for humans, we don't really have a notification that we're just about to die. So it'd be kind of nice if we got notified so we could take care of last minute things. But for components, they do get some notification. The component will unmount method will get called right before your component effectively dies or gets removed from the DOM. Any questions about just the general high level concept of these, I guess, life stages that a component or a human goes through? Okay, so let's actually talk about these stages a little more in detail there. So these are a few of the component methods or the lifecycle methods that exist. There are actually like a dozen of them, or maybe more than a dozen. For the most part, these three are the main ones you're going to interact with or deal with the majority of the time. Again, there are a few other special methods that kind of have special use cases depending on exactly what you're trying to do. But again, component did mount, component did update, and component will mount are the three that you want to focus on here. All right. So this is a nice diagram that kind of visualizes the flow of the lifecycle. So this is taken from projects.wajtekmaj. I can't pronounce that. So this is a kind of cool diagram. You can find this on the web. So actually, I'm going to look it up, but this is going to be our reference. So where'd my browser go here? There it is. So I just go to, what is it? React lifecycle diagram should be the first hit. Yep, there we go. React lifecycle methods diagram. So if you click on that, you get a diagram that looks like this. I'll make that a little larger. This is a simplified version of what your component actually goes through when it gets mounted for the first time. So when we talk about mounting, that's just creation. Updating is when it exists and just gets modifications, and the unmounting is when it gets effectively removed from the DOM. So let's talk about mounting first. So the mounting process, again, is when your component is created for the very first time and added to the DOM, which updates your screen from that. So mounting, the constructor is the very first thing that is called. All right, so again, that's your init method for Python classes. Constructor is the same thing for JavaScript classes. Then your component will actually have an initial render. Before anything else happens, your component will kind of get its initial rendered state created by React. After that initial render, component did mount will get called. So if you need to do anything after the first initial render, component did mount is the place to do that. A typical use case for component did mount is initializing API calls. So if you have a component that needs to make a fetch request to Caesar's Digital Sportsbook, for example, you will do that in your component did mount. That is the React recommended place to do it. I think theoretically you can do it in your constructor, but it is not recommended that you do that initial call in your constructor. So again, this is going off of React's documentation. Component did mount is the place to do it. The cool thing about this diagram is that you could actually click on these methods. If I click on component did mount, this will take me to the official React documentation and give me a lot more background on component did mount. So again, if you're curious, if you want more background, I think this diagram is a nice visual, kind of giving you all the the ins and outs of the lifecycle. But if you want a technical description and more detail, the React docs have a pretty good description of what all these methods do. So there's component did mount. We'll talk about component did update, I guess now. So after the mounting process, again, this is the first time your component is created and thrown onto the screen. Then your component is just living, just like we're humans, we're living right now. We can go through an update. So updating can happen in mainly two ways. One is from a props change, and the second is from a state change. Sorry, we're going through a security thing here. So, all right.
Distracting for the in-person students.
What was that?
It's distracting for the in-person students.
Okay, let me know if we want to take a pause here. It should be over probably in a couple minutes, but I'm just gonna power through. But if you guys need me to pause, just let me know. So we have updating. Again, once your component is living, it can go through a series of updates. So the two ways a component is going to automatically be updated is if any of its state values change, or any of the props that are coming in from a parent component change for this given component. So we've talked about this before, that we should never manually update state and prop values. That's because React wants to go through this process where if anything changes with regards to state or props, it's going to automatically trigger a re-render. Now, important thing to keep in mind is that a re-render doesn't automatically mean that your component is going to change on the screen. Basically, React is going to compute what the rendered component should look like. It's going to compare that with what you have on the screen. And there's a diffing algorithm that's going to figure out, all right, I need to actually update this point in my screen. If your rendered, if the computer render of React is the same thing as what you have on the screen, then there's no modification that it needs to make to the screen. So it's not actually going to update your screen or refresh your screen by any means. All right, so again, React smartly updates your screen as it needs to. And the reason that's really effective or really beneficial is that screen rendering is really expensive in terms of your application resources. So like rendering to the screen just takes a lot of time. Respectfully, like, you know, for our purposes, it seems pretty quick, but in terms of computer processing time, like rendering to the screen is pretty expensive time-wise. Anyway, so that render will happen from any state or props change. After a re-render has happened, component did update is a method that will get called by React automatically. So again, if you need to do anything in response to an update that happens, you can handle that in component did update. Finally, we have component will unmount. This isn't used as often, but this is basically your place to kind of clean up things that your component needs to kind of do before it dies or gets unmounted from the DOM. All right, so this diagram, pretty handy. I think it's kind of cool that you can click on the links. It shows you visual flow, again, what triggers renders, how everything kind of is set up. As I mentioned, this is kind of like the simplified version. If you are on this page and click this checkbox that show less common life cycles, yeah, there are more methods in this equation. Not a lot more, but you know, get derived state from props, should component update. There's a few more in there, so maybe not quite a dozen. Maybe I overestimated there, but there are more methods that exist in the lifecycle that you can leverage should you need to. Any questions about this diagram or what mounting, updating, or unmounting kind of signify for our component?
So go ahead, sorry.
Is the constructor, so it's just the very first part, class, whatever, extends component?
No, so good question. We have not seen this too often, but let me just create a quick JavaScript file. So I think we introduced this on the first day of React, but totally understandable if we forget because we don't use classes in JavaScript very often. But if I create a class, I use the class keyword, and then I'll say this is my base class, for example. And then I'll create that. And let's say I create a derived class, a class derived class. That extends is basically how you use inheritance. So in this case, derived class will extend the base class. So derived class will inherit everything from base class. All right. The constructor is specifically a method called constructor. Again, just like in Python, you have to use underscore init or the dunder init method if you want to kind of have that functionality. You need to have a method called constructor that will take in whatever parameters you want. So I might take in, you know, counter, date, name. I don't know what I'm creating here, but whatever values you want to take in, just like your init method in Python takes in parameters, your constructor can do that also, and you will assign them to instance attributes or variables by using the this keyword. So this counter, and hopefully you guys are making these connections to Python classes because it is very, very similar. Dates, etc. All right. So again, the constructor must be named constructor, and this is where you could kind of initialize, you know, some internal variables, anything else you might want to do. Again, this is not typical for components in React. This is specifically just for creating classes in JavaScript. So classes are a concept that exists outside of React.
But I guess, is the class, is that doing it automatically too? Because I don't see it in the lesson.
So you don't need to have a constructor. So if you omit a constructor, that's totally fine. There's a default constructor created, and that basically does nothing aside from passing down like relevant data. So technically speaking, since we're talking about it, if this were a component, so I know I'm not in a React app right now, but if we did, you know, extend component, right? We need to always derive from the React component. Hopefully you guys can play along with me at home because I'm not in a React app right now. But this is that React component that we always need to extend from. So let's say we have my component. If you create the constructor, again, normally you do not need to create it. a default constructor will be created for you. But if you opt to create a constructor, and let's say I don't know what you were doing here, honestly, but if you create this, props is something that's passed to the constructor, and you must pass this down to your base class. So if you remember with functional components, we have function, my components function. We've taken props just as a parameter here, right? It's always it's always the first parameter that the functional component gets, called props. Likewise, your constructor for a React component, props is the first value that is passed to your constructor for a class-based component. If you decide to implement a constructor, always remember to pass down the props to your base class. So this component class needs those props, because again, props have a lot of magic built into them behind the scenes. So component needs to know about those props, else stuff is probably not going to work correctly. Was there another question out there?
Just to piggyback on Ty's question there. It is when we create a new instance of the component, that is when the actual mounting takes place though. Like when I use the new operator, that's when that first event happens and the conception of the that conception actually begins.
Yes and no. So for typical, just for regular classes, again, if we're just talking outside of React context, like if I have my base class again, yes, when we do that new keyword, so if I want to create an instance of my base class, I totally can. So let's call it BC equals new base class. So yeah, when you do that new base class, this is when your constructor gets automatically called. So I'll pass in, some props. Let's say props exist out here. Yeah, so when you call that new and then the class name, that's when you actually create an instance, and yep, that's when your constructor gets called. But again, as we said before, normally you're not going to need to create a constructor. So inside of a React app, let's actually just create a React app because I'm going to need one anyway. And it takes a while, so I'm going to do npx create React app, and I'm going to call this Lifecycle app, and we'll let that do its thing. But yeah, for React components, an instance, what happened there? Okay, so it wants an empty directory. Not sure why it's so picky. Nope. Oh, sorry, I'm in the wrong directory. All right, let's get back to new terminal. Will solve the issue. All right, so in my sandbox, I'm going to do npx create React app Lifecycle app. All right, there it goes. All right, so I'll take a minute, but yeah, for React apps, we don't use a new keyword, right? The only time like an instance gets created is when we actually just render it from the render method from a component. So when a component is rendering something, if that creates a child component, when that render happens, that child component gets created within that render, and that is when effectively that constructor will be called if we have a constructor. So let's just do this thing. Let's go back to our slides. So again, this diagram, very good reference. Make sure you find it online and kind of make sure you understand the flow of a component's lifecycle. That is not what I want. All right, so let's talk about mounting. Again, we kind of glaze over this. Let's talk about the methods a little more in detail. So mounting is the idea of creating a component for the first time. So again, these are the four methods that get called. Again, the constructor you'll probably not use very often. Get derived from state from props. That is a static method, meaning it's not an instance method. So static means you can call it without having an instance created. And this, again, you can read documentation on this. I'm not going to spend time on it. Render is that method that we see all the time, where we render from our component, and then componented mounts is the last thing that gets called as part of the mounting process. So talking about the constructor, we can use the constructor to initialize our state value. We don't have to. We've seen many times where we just initialize state, kind of like a class variable. That is fine with React components. This bind issue is something we've talked about before. Since we don't use class-based components very often, You guys can kind of Google this. I don't want to spend too much time on it. But the constructor is the place you want to bind this keyword. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, that's totally fine. We can just put this on a back burner. But there's an idea of this pointer kind of gets lost when you're calling handlers from components. So like the onClick handler for your button might call a class method, or sorry, instance method. But this keyword is relevant if you want to refer to something in the class. And for it to work correctly, you need to bind this keyword to each method. Now, again, I'm sure 95% of you guys are like, what is this guy talking about? We can kind of glaze over this. Just know that if you need to bind this keyword, the constructor is a place to do it.
And you can avoid bind by using arrow functions.
Yes, thank you, Tom. So we've mentioned kind of in passing, like just use fat arrow functions and I'll save you some trouble. We haven't really told you what that trouble is, mostly because we've not been using class components. But yes, if you use fat arrow functions, you will not have to worry about binding. So that's another benefit of using fat arrow functions. Again, I know binding is a new concept and we don't need to spend time on it. So it's okay not knowing what I'm talking about here. The last thing I just want to mention here is if you are doing something in the constructor, you should not cause side effects. So you should not call set state within your constructor. You should not update anything that's going to trigger a re-render in your constructor. That's not the place to do it. All right. Component did mount is the place you want to do anything that might modify state. So again, initialize a state that relies on a DOM could be one case. So let's say I want to know the width of a button. That button needs to be added to the DOM for me to actually measure it, like know its height or width or its text. It's got to have some physical presence on the DOM. So this, again, component did mount happens after an initial render happens for your component. So that render will create something that exists on the DOM, and you can pick off elements. Like if you need to, access get element by ID, you do that in component did mount. Component did mount is pretty much the recommended place to do initial API calls. So let's say I'm loading up my application and I want to quickly get weather data from an API. Component did mount is the appropriate place to do it. Again, the constructor is not where you want to do it because that could cause some side effects. So again, component did mount, make initial API calls. You can call set state from component did mount. Important thing to note, this is just from the documentation. This will precede the initial screen update. So it's kind of confusing that we have initial render, but your screen doesn't actually update immediately. Your component did mount can kind of introduce some new changes, and that will be the first thing that is shown on your screen. I know that's a little confusing, so we'll see an example of it. But know that you can call set state. You're not going to see a flicker between like your initial state and your updated state. You'll only see the result of the set state that you do in your component did mount. Okay. Next, we're going to talk about updating. So updating, again, the idea of aging, or basically events that happen while your component is alive. There's a few methods that are going to get called. Again, I know this is kind of intimidating. Like you don't have to memorize all these methods. A lot of these are available, or all of them should be available on the documentation page. So if you're curious, you can kind of click on these, like get derived state from props. What the hell is that? Well, I can go to the docs and read all about it. So I'll leave that to you guys if you guys are curious about these methods. But we're just going to point out the main ones you want to know. So get derived state from props. Don't worry about that. Don't really care. Should component update? That one is interesting to know about. Again, you're not going to use it very often, but this can kind of circumvent additional rendering if you know for sure that you don't need to render anything from an update. Again, this is a kind of a fringe case, like a rare use case where you might run into, but just know that this can prevent a render from even being computed. And the reason you might want to do that is because rendering can be expensive, right? You're doing a lot of computations, React's doing a lot of stuff behind the scenes. If you have a situation where you're like, all right, this value changed, but I know from this value changing that I don't need to re-render, you can inspect the next props and next state values, which are basically the props and state values that are being changed. So your current values are still intact. You're going to get information about the next prop values and next state values. You can compare your current values to your next values and kind of determine, all right, I see that my counter updated from 9 to 10, but that I know based on my logic that I don't need to change anything on the rendering. You can just say, all right, don't do a render based on this particular state update or this prop update. So if you look at that diagram we had up here, where did it go? So should component update, this X just means you could abort that render attempt. It's just gonna circumvent it. It'll save you processing time. And kind of speed up your application if like the rendering is super, expensive. Usually for our apps that we're creating, you're not gonna notice any difference, but rendering can be kind of expensive if your page has like, 1 million components on it. What other methods we have? So render, we talked about. Get snapshot before update. Not going to touch that one. But component update is the next major method that we want to talk about. So component update actually takes in 3 parameters. These are optional, as in you don't necessarily have to capture them, but usually you want to. So you get the first parameter that's going to automatically be passed to this method is called, again, you can call it whatever you want, but these are going to be the previous properties that were set before the update even happens. So again, component update gets called after the update takes place. You can inspect what the previous prop values were and also the previous state values to actually determine if you need to do some additional, logic or rendering or whatever you might need to do. Snapshot, that's related to get snapshot before update. I'm not going to really talk about that because honestly, I don't really know what that does. But again, previous props and previous state, you're going to want to know what the previous value was and the current value, and then based on that comparison, do some appropriate logic. All right, so after this, so we talked about should component update returns a Boolean. So if you return true, which is default, it'll proceed rendering. If you determine you don't want to continue with the rendering process, return false from this method, and it'll abort the rendering process. As we talked about, it's cheaper to compare values than compare React rendering. So if you're worried about efficiency, this might be a method that you're going to investigate.
Hey, Angar, I think I wanted to mention too that where I've actually seen this used for it, I can't remember the exact use case, but I had a time when my component wouldn't update and I had to tell it, hey, no, you should be updating. I can't remember why, but you can do the inverse as well, where you can say, hey, no, I want you to update whenever this other thing happens.
Yeah, so I think force update can do that for you too. So there is a way to force an update. So again, normally React will automatically attempt to re-render when any of your state values or prop values change for a given component. That is automatic. If you as a developer, for some reason, again, I can't come up with a great use case, but if you know that your component needs to re-render, but it's not related to a state or prop change, there's a way to do it via force update. I've never really had to use this, but it just does exist. And notice that it actually circumvents should component update. So it's not even going to hit that method.
Yeah,
this is sort of unrelated to what, or not directly related to what James was talking about, but yeah, James was mentioning that you could use should component update to automatically proceed to a render when one would not normally happen. So that could be a use case also. Again, I've rarely had to deal with this. When I say rarely, I mean probably never. Like I've messed around with it, but realistically speaking, I've never really had to implement this method. All right, so that's the process of updating. The last thing we have, component update, we talked about this, respond to DOM changes. You can make more API calls. So again, you might have an initial API call. Let's say you want to get weather data. That could be your initial thing if you know the location of your user, right? Like I'm located in Chicago. If my browser has location data, maybe my website can pass that along and I could get like weather information automatically when I get to my website. But if I don't have location information available, I might have the user kind of enter in their location, and then based on that, I might fetch some weather data based on what location they tell me. So that'd be a use case for component update, where like a state value might change or a prop value might change. Where like, hey, the user enters, I'm located in Chicago, Illinois. Well, then once we get that information, we can make an API call to like a weather app saying, hey, give me the weather information for Chicago, Illinois. And then let's say they change the location to be Phoenix, Arizona. Well, then that's going to be another update where we can, check out the current state and make an API call based on that. This last note is very important. It's easy to kind of not understand or totally forget, but you should always conditionally check for anything that you're doing in component update. If you're making additional modifications to a state value or a prop value, you should always compare against the previous values. If you don't, you could get into an infinite loop where you update a state value that triggers a re-render, that render calls component update again, and that component update calls set state again. So you're going to get, again, that infinite loop there. All right, so just keep that in mind. We don't want infinite loops in our application. So if you're using component update, these previous props and previous state values can be very beneficial. All right, the last thing we'll talk about is unmounting. This isn't too complicated, kind of a sad moment in The Lion King. But there's only one method we need to care about for the unmounting process, and that is component will unmount. You're not going to be typically using this, but it can be useful for cleanup. When we talk about cleanup, one example is timers. So let's say you have a component that initializes a timer to basically like, call something every 5 seconds, right? We talked about set timeout as a JavaScript function. Timers kind of run forever until you kind of either end your application entirely or you manually disable that timer or kind of unset that timer. So for a component, your component might unmount, and if that created a timer, well, that timer might still run in the background, even though the component is dead because your application is still running. So if you set up a timer and component did mount, you want to clean it up or basically unset that timer and component will unmount. And this is one use case. There might be other resources that you need to clean up based on what your component was using. So this would be the place to do it. All right, so that was a lot of me lecturing. I know it's probably a lot of confusing. I think doing an example might kind of clear up some of our confusion. So let's go to our curriculum page if you are following along. Michael, you have a question?
Yeah, you may have said this, Ankur, at the beginning. I just want to make sure I'm following. The use effect is all of the stuff we just talked about is going to happen. And it's not specifically for like class-based components, right? It's also for functional components, or is and that I guess where I'm getting a little confused is like all of these sound really cool and like very detailed, but is like use effect like just generalizing all of those actions, and I guess I'm having a hard time conceptualizing the difference between like how this plays into the difference between class and functional, if it does at all.
Yeah, so good question. I will answer that mostly with we'll get to use effect in a second. So we've not introduced use effect yet. But yes, regardless if you have a class-based component or a functional-based component, they all go through this life cycle. So again, functional-based components and class-based components are the same thing. They're implementing the same ideas. It's just like the syntax is going to be a little different. But yes, the ideas of if you want to do something when the component's mounted initially or updating or going to be unmounted, you can do exactly the same thing in functional-based components, but the syntax is very different. So these methods that we just talked about are specifically for class-based components.
Thank you very much.
All right, so I'm going to take the code we have on the curriculum page just to have some starter code. Again, this is going to be a very simple app that's going to highlight these component methods for us. So I'm going to drop some code into my app.js, if I can find it. There it is. I don't want any of this. So I forgot my export default on that screen. So it's here. All right, so this is my app.js. Let's walk through it, make sure we kind of know what it's attempting to do. So this is a class-based component. Again, I know we've not seen this syntax very often, but something you might see based on legacy code or, for whatever reason, if your workplace decides to use class-based components, you should kind of understand the same ideas that exist across functional-based components and state-based or class-based components. So here we have state values. In this component, we have two state values, one that's called exists and one that is called some value. Again, this very generic naming. Exists is going to be, looks like a Boolean. Some value looks like it's going to be an integer or counter of some sort. So that is what our initial values are for state values. So again, this is usually the way you will initialize your state values in a class-based component. You can do it in the constructor, but usually you don't need a constructor to do it. All right, so that's our state values that we've created here. And then we have a render for our class-based component. Again, just to remind you guys, for our class-based component, you need specifically a method called render that's going to spit out your JSX that should be rendered to the screen. So here we have our parent div. We have a heading tag that just says Lifecycle app. Then we have a series of buttons. There's 3 buttons that we are attempting to create here. One button is called create, the other one's called update, third one's called delete. We're using an anonymous function right kind of in line for the click handler. So we're not creating separate functions. We're just kind of creating a very simple function on the spot. The create button is going to, looks like it's updating the exist state value. It's setting it to true. The delete button is updating the exist value to false. And the update value looks like it's updating, sorry, the handler is updating some value from our state. So again, we have 2 state values. The create and delete buttons are modifying the exist state value. And it looks like the update value is taking a random number that's going to be between 0 and 100. And that's just going to assign it to some value. Michael Robertson, you have a question?
The state values there that you have in that dictionary. So pretty much we're always going to have a dictionary called state that has all the individual state values in it. It's not like where we were kind of declaring them individually as we went along. We have to call it state, and then it's just going to be a dictionary, and then we could probably append to it later if we needed to. But
absolutely, yep, 100%. I'm glad you kind of brought this up. Yes, we must call a variable called state. Again, this is just naming restrictions for React. React is specifically going to look for something called state to kind of access these values. So similar to how we need to use the use state hook in functional components, we need to create something called state in a class-based component. Other things to kind of point out here, because again, we don't use classes very often. Anytime you're referring to anything within the class, you must use the this keyword. So again, the this keyword is very similar to that self keyword in Python that we use very often. But notice that when I need to get access to some value, I need to call this dot state. So that's going to get me to this dictionary. And then dot some value is going to get me to this value right here. Very common. I do this all the time. So I anticipate some of you guys might fall into this also. Very easy to forget or omit this keyword as you're creating class-based components, because again, we're used to function-based components, so this keyword is not really relevant there. But just keep in mind, you'll likely see an error. Like if let's say I take off this keyword right here, and I save my app right here. Let's see what my terminal is. Oops, I never started. So npm start, again, error. Yes. So I need to add a component. Components. And I'm going to add something called something.js. Again, very generic naming. I'm going to copy that component from our curriculum page. And it's written in a class-based component. So hopefully that doesn't throw you off. That stuff. All right, my second issue was I was not in the right directory. So I need to cd into Lifecycle app before I could run npm start. All right, so hoping I don't have any errors, but I did introduce an error here. So it's,
I think, does app need an export too?
app does.
Oh, it does have one.
I don't know if I left it off the curriculum page. Yeah, I forgot to add it here. So let me just add that just in case that bites anybody. Thank you for pointing that out. So we need exports, else that's not work. All right, so hopefully that doesn't throw anyone off, but yes, we do need to export from our app like normal. So export default app at the very bottom. All right, so right now I'm going to run npm start. Hopefully I don't have any errors, but we'll find out in like 5 seconds. Okay, so this brings up the browser. I'm going to toss that over to here. Let's go to our local host. And everything, if everything works correctly, we should see 3 buttons and not much else. It's taking a good amount of time. All right, there we go. So everything compiled successfully. We have our header and then 3 buttons. I wanted to show you what happens if you leave off of this keyword. And it's just like any other variable. It's not going to know what you're talking about. It's basically you're trying to reference a variable that it doesn't know about. You've never created it. So if I save this, yep, you'll see, all right, state is not defined. Again, this might throw you for a loop a little bit, be like, no, I've actually defined state. What are you talking about, React? Like this, you're lying to me. Well, that's not actually true. Again, state is an internal value for this class. It's an instance value. So we need to use this keyword to access it. All right, so this dot state will give us access to this object or dictionary. If you want to call it dictionaries, I call it a dictionary often just from Python speak. but it's an object that we're creating here. All right, so with these two components that I copied from the curriculum page, again, app.js, we walk through it together. We have a state value, two state values exist in some value. We have three buttons that are effectively updating our state values. Either exists or some value are being modified by these button clicks. And then we have our rendering right here. All right, so again, we're doing a conditional rendering here. If the Boolean value for exists, if that is true, we're actually going to show our component. So that is that our component is called something. We're gonna render that to our screen. If the exist value becomes false or is false, we're gonna return null, which means don't add anything from this block of JSX. It's just gonna be empty. There's nothing we created on the DOM for that. Any questions about our app.js?
So exists is just a state variable, and all that is doing there on line 24 is just checking whether or not that state variable is true or false.
Yep.
If
got
it's true, we show it. If it's false, we don't show it. Okay, is that correct?
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Always good to make sure we understand. So yep. So that's going to be Boolean value. It's going to toggle back and forth based on some actions that we do with the buttons. Based on wherever that value is, as Michael said, yep, we're going to either show this component or we're just going to show nothing.
I'm curious,
So be true or false, do one or the other. Is there a question?
about the null. I'm just wondering which is better, null or empty string? Because I'm guessing null because it actually will render nothing versus actual string or something. Just curious.
I don't have a good answer for that. When you're asking what's better, empty string works just as well. I don't think that, again, either way, it's not going to render anything to your DOM. It's not going to add anything to your DOM. It's going to be nothing effectively. I prefer null. Just I don't know why. I don't have a great reason for it. It just makes more sense to me. Empty string seems like it's something, even though it's nothing for your rendering. But yeah, I don't know which one necessarily is quote unquote better. So I guess dealer's choice, if unless someone else has a better reasoning for one or the other. Okay, so that's our app component. Question?
Ankur, when would we use the and? Could we use it there where it says this dot state dot exist and something value?
I think that's totally valid. So yep, this is kind of a shortcut way where if this is true, it's going to proceed to the second part of your and. So yeah, this would be a kind of slightly shorter way to write it. Again, and if this part evaluates a false, this second part is never evaluated. This is an idea called short circuiting, where anytime you have an and operation, you do the left side first. If the left side fails, then this entire expression is going to be false no matter what. So we will never evaluate the second part for an and. The same is true for an or. So you're not going to probably use ors that often. An or, if the first part is true for an or statement, the second part never needs to be evaluated because again, true or something else is always going to be true. Likewise, false and logical and something else is always going to be false. So this goes into a discussion of optimization, which we will have a presentation on at some point. But yeah, you can do it this way if that's easier to understand. Totally go for it. Yeah, I'm just going to leave that in there because that makes my code a little shorter. But yeah, we're achieving the same thing. Basically, based on this value, we're either going to show something or show nothing. All right, so let's actually look at our something component and make sure we understand what's going on here. There's not much to it. The something component is pretty simple component. If we look at the render, all the render is doing is taking in a props value. Again, keep in mind this is a class-based component. So we need to reference the props using this dot props. If you just do props, it's not going to know what you're talking about. So if I do props.value, I'm going to get yelled at by React shortly. Yep, props is not defined. That's because I've not referenced it via this dot keyword. Right, so this component for its render, all we're doing is showing this value and the actual value that got passed down to it. Again, this is a props value, so that's coming from above its parent component. It's coming from its parent component. But let's take a look at what we have above here.
Hey, Ankur, I have kind of a weird question. Can you just structure this props and then just use value, or you can't do it in class component?
No, you can totally do it. I don't have great reasons for my tendencies, but I usually don't destructure very often. So, but you can. So if you want, destructor, type destructure. Yeah, you could do my value. Or sorry, you could do value equals this dot props. Yep. Any object you can destructure it via the syntax, but I need to do let, I think. What am I doing here? Value. Yes, this is possible. I don't know what my syntax
Is it props with an S?
I do need an S.
Ankur, where is it coming in exactly? Like, where do we declare that we're calling it props?
Good question. So I'm going to table the destructor thing. It is possible because, again, this is an object, so you can destructor an object. I'm not sure why I'm having an issue here.
Because it's in a class base and you're doing it, and you have to do it within the render method.
Okay. So thank you, Tom. So it looks like we got to do it within this function here. There we go. Thank you. So yeah, you can destructure it. So this will capture value. Let's actually just do this to make sure we're not lying to anyone. But yeah, this destructuring totally works is the answer to the question that was asked. The second question that was asked there was, sorry, what was the second question?
Where's props coming in from?
Yes, where's props coming in from? Great question. So this goes into this component base class that we're deriving from. Let me try to dig into it. Again, I don't always have success with it. Go to definition. Let's see. Am I going to find what I'm looking for? No, so there's props coming into here. So this is the constructor. I wish there's an easy way to pop this up. VS Code, why are you doing this to me? So there should be a way to open this file, but guess I could just send right here. So if you actually look at the component file, so that's what I did. I right-clicked on it or control-click, go to definition. And then if you look here, there's a constructor inside of component that takes in props. So props is being handled by the component class. So that's kind of where it's nested. That's where it's coming from. So when you do this dot props, it's accessing it from the base class. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, 100%, because it kind of like creates a key of props, and then the value is the stuff that's being passed in as a dictionary, kind of.
Sorry, what was that?
I think you clarified it.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, yeah. But yeah, so the component again has a lot of baked-in logic to it. That's the whole idea of inheritance. We are inheriting everything that a component would do for us, and then adding on to it with our something component. So yeah, props is automatically handled. We're not seeing it pass, but it's being passed automatically. As I sort of introduce, you can capture it. Again, I don't have a good use case for this, so I'm just going to type this just for example's sake. If you create a constructor, you could take the first parameter you get is props. You need to pass it down to your base class. So if I create a constructor, and let's say I want to do something else like a console log time in the constructor. Like this might be a stupid example, but let's say I want a console log specifically when I get into the constructor. Well, then yes, I need to create a constructor so that I can add logic to do whatever I want to. But I need to take the props that my constructor gets now and pass it down to the base class because the base class is managing that data. So I'm actually going to leave this in here because, yeah, why not? Constructor. And let's write a message. I'm in seat. Okay, so I added another console log here. If you guys want to add it, go for it. But now we have a constructor that's doing nothing at all aside from printing out when we actually reach that constructor. Otherwise, again, just to highlight, we have to pass down props to the base class. If we do not, stuff will go wrong. You'll probably not be happy. React probably will be unhappy if you don't pass on props. Okay, so again, hopefully you understand the something component. It's doing very minimal things. It's rendering a value. That's all it's doing. Additionally, we have console logs at different life stages of this component. We have component did mount, which we talked about is when we are born. And then component update is when we are aging. per se, and then component will update is when we are about to die. Let's say, I guess, right after. So after initial render, this method gets called. After an update happens, this method gets called. And after, right before we're about to be, I guess, killed off the screen, this method gets called. All right, so let's actually see this in action. So I'm going to run my application. Hopefully I have no errors. So it looks like line 23 and something that go away. All right, yeah, I fixed that error. All right, so I'm gonna go to my application now. All right, so this is our Lifecycle app, nothing too complicated here. So again, just to remind you, when we click the create button, that's gonna update a state value in our app and set it to true. When that value gets set to true, if you guys remember, that's going to render our something component for the first time. Right now, our something component does not exist here. There is nothing here. There's not like, it's not the something component that's like invisible. The something component has never been created. So there's nothing here in terms of the something component. So when I hit create, we set our exist value to true, which will force a re-render of our app component because that is a state value, which means when we come back to our render method, this is true. Therefore, our something component will be created for the first time. So let's hit, I'm going to bring up my property inspector so we could kind of see some console logs. All right, so hit create. Notice that two things got printed out. We got I am being conceived because the constructor is the very first thing it gets called when your component gets created, like even before it's rendered. The constructor gets called and we have I am being conceived. Also, after the render happened, we component did mount gets called and says I am alive now. Right? That happened on the create. Based on the way we wire this up, we hit create like 20 times. It's going to create that something only once. We're not creating additional something components with each create. We're limited to one based on what we cleared up. All right, now the update, if you guys remember, the update is simply going to get a random number between 1 and 100 and set that to a state value inside the app. So that state value is called some value because I was not creative with naming today. Some value is going to be updated. Again, since that's a state value, it's going to automatically trigger a re-render. And specifically, our something component is relying on that value. So we have a prop that's being passed down that's relying on the some value state value. So when this value updates, it's going to update the props for something. And because of that, we get into component did update. Now, this is something that I was talking about earlier, where you want to check the previous and the current value to make sure that you are actually wanting to update based on something that's going on. You sometimes can get away with not doing this. I think specifically if I didn't have this here, let's actually test it out. I'm not going to get an infinite loop because there's no modifications being made by component did update. Like I'm calling console log, that is not going to change the state of my component here. So technically speaking, I don't think I need that check. Let me verify that by running this. All right. So let me refresh my app. All right, we create. Oh, I do need that there. Sorry. All right, so take back what I said in the last 20 seconds. But create, again, we call the constructor component did mount. When we click update, notice we get a component did mount. Typo. Component did update. Sorry about that. Will unmount. Guess I wasn't really super clear on this. Will unmount. All right, so sorry, I had some typos in my console logs. Don't want to confuse us. So creates, constructor gets called, component did mount gets called. I call update. Notice we had a component did update. I am updating now. We as many times we click that, we get many updates. So clicked it the second time, we got a second update. Third time, every single time we get an update. Notice our value is changing. Therefore, our previous value right here is not going to match the new value that is being set via the props. Therefore, we print out this message. All right, so we hit update, keep doing that. We just more component updates. Finally, we hit delete. Again, delete's going to change our Boolean value state of Boolean state value to false, which means that we are going to no longer render this something component. So something exists on our screen right now. It's part of the DOM. So it's living right now, it's living, breathing component. But once we set exists to false, our render is going to say, okay, we don't need to render something anymore. Let me take that off the DOM. It's on there right now. So basically it's going to kill off that component. So if I hit delete, notice we get component will unmount. I am dying. Any questions on when these methods are getting called? Kind of how everything's kind of wired up here? Important thing, just to reiterate, if it's not clear, you must name your methods component did mount. Again, you don't have any choice. React is specifically going to call this method, and you need to do the logic here. Again, if you call this component did mount, donuts, not going to work. You don't have that name flexibility in this case.
Ankur, I've really enjoyed this demonstration. It's helped a lot. I'm wondering right now, since that since that component is dead, if you click create, does that start it over again? I'm being conceived, or no? That's
yes, it creates a brand new component. So the one that died, doesn't get reused. It's going to create a brand new item, and yes, it's going to go through the constructor again and go through the mounting process all over again. So we hit create, we get another one got created. That's totally separate from the previous one that existed. But again, anytime we do an update, that is updating the existing one. It's not, so I want to be clear. It is not recreating like a brand new component and with a new value. It is reusing the component. And this is the whole idea of React, where React's not going to like update things prematurely. So if you have a component that exists that's going to exist after the re-render, it's not going to like kill it off and then, or drop it and re-add it. It's just going to keep it and update it as you would expect.
It's like death and rebirth, the circle of life, kind of.
Exactly. If we watch Lion King, we learned all about the circle of life. Okay, so this is a very, very basic primer on these methods. Again, kind of understand that these exist for your benefit. As in, if you need to do something after birth, after an update, or right before death, that's why these methods exist. So that you as a developer can kind of hook into those lifecycle stages and do what you need to do. As we talked about, just to reiterate myself, I know I'm repeating myself, component mount is a popular commonplace, or is a very common place to do your initial API calls. So if you need to like fetch some data when your application just kind of loads up, component mount is where you make that initial API call. Component update, also you'll see some API calls based on state changes. So if for example you need user input, and based on that user input you can go fetch some data, component update will make some API calls. But keep in mind that that API call might update your state values, and that is why again you need to check this specifically. Right now I'm not checking state at all. This is targeting specifically this props value. You can have multiple props, so I could also have like if prev props dot other not equal this dot props dot other, say console log. I like donuts. All right, so again, you can target specifically what is changing in this method. So I guess we need another button for this. So let me do this quickly. I know we're due for a break, so we'll take that after this quick change. So I'm going to add a new button. This new button is going to do, let's say, other value will be a state that I'm adding. Okay, and then I'll add a state to other value here. And lastly, I'm going to pass in a new prop value to my component. So other will be equal to this dot state dot other value. All right, so now we have 4 buttons: update value, and then update other, for lack of creative naming. All right, so notice that we are updating 2 different values. One is updating some value, the other is updating other value. And then we have 2 props that we're passing down. So the reason I added this was because I wanted to show that, again, you can react based on a specific prop changing. And that is again, the whole reason why you have access to the previous props. So that if property X changes, I could do one thing. If property Y changes, do another thing. Again, it's all up to you what you need to do. So like if other changes, I might not need to do a full update and then do a partial update. Well, let's see this in place. So I want to clear my console. We create a component. Now if I update value, notice I get updating. I click update other, I'm going to see I like donuts, which is a true statement. If I click that many times, I just keep updating that, update value. Then let's get this off the component, so, or off the DOM. So I deleted it, it's dead now. And as I mentioned, component will unmount. You're probably not going to use it very much, if at all, for our challenges, but it is useful to know about, just in case you need to do something right before the component is removed. All right, with that, let's take a well-deserved break here. So, all right, so yeah, we had a question about something I mentioned earlier about you can affect your state value in component did mount, and that's going to trigger a re-render, but you're not going to see a flicker on the screen because that re-render will happen before anything is updated on your screen. So let's actually kind of code this up in here. So how do I want to do this? Let's create a state value. Get some good practice with class-based components. So I'm going to create a state value inside my something component. Just for this example, it's not going to be very sensible. I'm going to call this donuts. We'll call this yummy. All right, so I have a state value called donuts, and initial value is going to be yummy. What if I want to update that state value in my component did mount? Again, you can imagine this for actual data, that makes sense, but state values are state values here. So, so if I call set states, again, this is a good practice on remembering how to update state values. We got to call this dot set state. We want to pass it a dictionary for only the value you want to update here. So let's say hypothetically I had, again, green beans. Let me paste that, and that was yucky. So I have two state values. If I only want to update one of them, well, that's the only thing I need to pass inside my dictionary. So we do donuts equals very yummy. I'm going to add some very, 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 very here just for a reason I'll talk about later. But so we call it component did upmount, React calls component did mount. We are choosing to update the state value because we received some new information or whatever happened. Like a typical case, I guess if you want to talk about real use cases, is maybe when it made an API call to like an API that gives you descriptions of food. And we made that API call, we got some data back eventually, and then we call set state. So in that case, we're updating after our API call. So set state is going to update our state value, and then we're going to see something on our screen. So it's actually the other is other. This is from our props. And then we're going to have a third item that we're going to render here. So let's say donuts are this dot state dot donuts. All right, so the reason I added this state value is because I want to show that we have an initial value here of yummy, and then we are updating it to very, very yummy after the initial render. So there's a distinction between render and what you see on your screen. So initial render happens where like React kind of mocks up what it wants to show on the screen, but it calls component did mount, and we are allowed to do some logic here before React even puts anything on your screen. So now that I added very, very, very yummy, let's actually see if we see any flicker or not when we load this component. So let me go back to my Lifecycle app. If I hit create, I guess that's not as easy to see. Put these in paragraphs. Actually, I'm just going to remove these for now, I guess. I just want to show what we see initially. So if I refresh my app, notice when I hit create, I mean, it might seem like super quick, but it's not super quick. There's no flicker going on. So when I hit create, notice you see donuts are very, very, very yummy. There's no donuts are yummy intermediate state. Like I could say, even if I wanted to lie to you guys, I could say yucky in caps, right? You're not going to see this ever put onto the screen because this initial value gets overridden by this set state. And that processing, even though set state is asynchronous, is going to complete before React throws anything onto your screen. So if I refresh this again, let's get rid of this, and hit create, notice you see the set state value from component did mount. The initial value is never shown on screen here. All right, so again, that's something I mentioned earlier. I think that's what the question was about. But yeah, you are allowed to call set state here. And whatever you set state to will effectively be the initial thing you see on screen, and it's not going to rely on the initial value here. Did I answer your question, Yippee?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, cool. All right, let's continue
Also, I had
on.
a question, Ankur.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just want to ask real quick. So, for the state, the exist value is different than like all the other values, right? Like whenever you put exist.
No, exist is a value I named.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, again, I have very generic naming, so that's my apologies. But that state value we had in app.js, yeah, I called it exists. That is not a special reserved keyword. I just called it. So,
Okay.
so I could call it created or something else, but yeah, again, generic naming, probably not the best for examples, but yeah, that's a good question to ask. Always good to be clear on what we're dealing here. Yeah, so state is a reserved item. You must call your state values state, but anything you put in here that is string variables, just like normal. But great question to ask though. Okay, so we talked about class-based components, but as we've talked about over and over, functional-based components are like the new hot new way of doing things, and we are focused on function-based components here. So how do we achieve what we are doing here? So we have, component did mount. I'm going to get rid of my donuts example because that's cluttering up what I'm trying to show here. Let's get the state value out of here. Okay, so we're back to effectively what we had before, where we have a constructor, print out something, component did mount, print out something. We have two prop values in this case, where we have props, we have a value prop and an other prop. That's something we just added in here. Again, we're able to control when we react to which, and we also have component will unmount. Now the question is, how do we achieve this in functional components? Well, the short answer is with use effects. So we've introduced this, I think, a bit before. You've seen it in some of our coding examples. We haven't really talked about it in full. So use effect, react, there's probably good documentation. Using the effects hook. Again, you guys can read this page, probably should give it a good glance because I have a lot of details here. But we're just going to kind of expedite the process here. So let's go to our slides. So we talked about the life cycle. We could achieve the same life cycle. That's going to bother me. We can achieve the same thing with use effects. So let's call this use effects. All right, can't have a title wrapping into two different lines. That's unseemly. All right, so this is use effects. You've probably seen this in code. This is the basic structure of it. You need to import use effect from React, just like any other React function or component. So use effect underscore use capital E effect takes in two parameters. The first parameter is going to be a function. So this anonymous function I'm creating here. Looks like I'm actually missing something there. That should be curly brace, I think. There's that mistake on every slide. That's not good. All right, hopefully you guys can live with my 4 slides here. But so this is a basic syntax. Use effect takes in a function, which is this part right here. The second part is optional, but usually recommended. You're gonna almost always have the second part, which is called a dependency array. So again, we're gonna recreate those lifecycle methods effectively with use effect. So use effect is all 3 of those in one if you want it to be. So use effect, the orange part I've highlighted here is called a dependency array. With an empty dependency array, anything you do in this use effect is going to be your component did mount logic. So anything you would have done in component did mount with class-based components, you will just do with creating a use effect and have an empty dependency array. Again, this is important. If you omit this, you get different behavior. What this effectively is doing is saying, when my component kind of renders for the first time, do this logic first. So do something just one time and only one time. It's never going to, this logic is never going to re-execute after this point. All right, so that's component did mount. Again, the key thing is using use effects and an empty dependency array. Empty is not the same thing as omitting it, so keep that in mind. All right, the second thing we might want to recreate is component did update. Now this one gets a little different with use effects. So if you omit that dependency array, you will be effectively doing component did mount and component did update all in one. So without a dependency array, that is handling both the initial case and the updating case for your component. All right, so just to Remember, with empty array, that's component did mount effectively. Without that, it's both did mount and update all in one. Next up, let's talk more about this dependency array. So you can pass in certain specific values. So they're usually going to be prop values or state values for your component into your dependency array. So in this example, where I have my state, that's a state value that I created. My state, anytime that changes, that's going to trigger this, this logic. But in addition to that, the very first time my component loads, this do something will also be called. So it's both component did mount and a component update only for my state value. So if we go back to our code, just to kind of correlate that, it's effectively doing this check for us in that case. So in this case, we're checking props. We could check, state values just as easily. So if we had previous state, I think I had something called donuts, which I removed, does not equal this dot state dot donuts. We could do whatever else we want to do. Console log donuts has changed. All right. Again, I get rid of that state value. I guess I should add it in. So this will actually compile. State equals donuts. Let's just set that to empty string. All right. So again, we can check the previous donuts value and current donuts value, and then based on that, if they're different, we can execute something. With use effects, that's what this is specifying. We're saying anytime this changes, React will check the previous value and the current value. If those are different, it'll proceed to do the do something. So in this case, my do something is console logging, but again, that do something can be whatever you need it to be.
Does the truthiness or falsiness of the value matter at all?
I mean, I guess it can if it were a Boolean value, but no, it's not investigating any Boolean state here. This could be a dictionary. This could dictionaries get a little complicated, but this could be an integer. This could be a string. It's going to compare the actual values. It's not going to be truthy or falsy.
Okay, thank you. That's what I got confused on yesterday, trying to figure out myself.
Cool. All right. So again, use effects. I'm going to say this now. It is pretty confusing, and that's why we started with class-based components. So understanding what component did mount, what component did update, and what component will unmount effectively are doing, like what point in lifecycle they execute. That should translate to functional components, but it's a little harder to understand with use effect kind of doing all of them together. So proceeding on, what if we want to do, so as we mentioned with this is a combination of component did mount and did update. If we have a dependency item, that's component did mount still executes, as in this will still execute the very first time. What if we only want to do a component did update? Well, that gets a little trickier with use effect. There might be a better way. I've not researched this extensively, but based on my limited research, the way you want to do it gets a little complicated here. We're using something called useRef, which we've never talked about before. If you can take my simplified explanation of it, useRef is like a state value, but it does not trigger re-render. It keeps track of a value between function calls. So each time your functional component gets called, your ref will keep track of the value. It's like a static value in effect. So we're using something called myRef, initializing it to true in this case. And we're going to use the value of myRef to determine if this were our initial render or not our initial render. That's all we're doing here. So it might look like a lot of logic, but we're just trying to have a Boolean that says, is this our very first render, yes or no? So initially, we're going to say yes, true. MyRef is going to be true. To access the ref value, we need to do a dot current. Again, I know this is new syntax. Kind of just take my word for it. But myref.current is going to reference the current value of this ref. And then we're going to check, if that is true, we set that to false and we return. So this will avoid doing anything on the first render. So this will avoid doing the component did mount portion of the use effect. So if it's our first render, it's going to hit this if statement and return. It's not going to get to do something. So this is the way you would do component did update. Again, it's not trivial. Use effect just kind of complicates that matter if we only want to do an update and don't want to do something on the initial mount.
Ankur,
Right, so again,
I'm sorry. I just when you had shown that last slide, I was trying to think through this, like how do you not do the whole component did mount and just did the update? And I was thinking that or at least I was thinking that, isn't that where like, and maybe I'm getting these mixed up, but is that kind of like where set state would come in, where I can just use use state or whatever it is that we were using to like track the change of a specific state? Is that do a similar thing, or am I like mixing my wires up here?
They're related, but they're not interchangeable. So use state, as we're using up here, use state is when you want to create a state value that React will automatically track for you. So anytime that state value updates, React will re-render your component. Now, the reason you might need to use a use effect is if you, the developer, need to react to something changing. So a state value or a prop value might change. And if you're like, all right, if my state value changed, I need to do something additional. Like one example I could give you is, imagine an input box that takes in a zip code and we want to fetch weather information. So if I type in 60606 and hit enter, we're going to fetch weather information. So let's say then I go back to that input box and type in 48108. That would be a state change, and that would trigger another API call. So my API call would be my use effect. That's kind of dependent on my state changing. So it's going to the value of my state. So in this case, my zip code, that will trigger some additional logic whenever that changes. The reason we need to do this is because that state change is asynchronous. We can't simply say, hey, let's update our state value and then do something right after it, right? We saw that example where we updated a state value and did a console log of that state value. We saw that the console log was actually the previous value, because set state changes are asynchronous. So because they're asynchronous, this use effect effectively lets you react eventually whenever that update happens.
Okay, yeah, I think I'm following that. So and I know this like gets really technical and stuff, and I don't even know if I can like communicate what I'm trying to say, but in other examples, we were calling, like in this example, we were calling like set my state. So if somebody did something on the screen, it might call set my state.
Yep.
And then set my state would update the state based on the state changing, right? Like, so somebody does something on the screen, it's like updates their zip code.
Yep.
And then we're calling set my state to do something. And so I felt like in my mind, like that was handling the a state change, but not necessarily like remounting. But like in this case, like use effect, could use effect be calling set my state if we wanted to?
It could, but you should not. So
okay.
The reason is because this use effect right here is dependent on my state. My state changes will trigger this logic. If in your logic you wind up updating my state, well, that's going to call use effect again, which sometimes you might have a construct that does that, but you need to specifically have something that prevents an infinite loop. If you have this, like if do something is actually updating my state, this will be an infinite loop.
Gotcha. Thank you, Ankur.
Yep. Again, it gets complicated. I am not going to kind of like say this is simple or easy. I think class-based components just make a lot more sense for understanding life cycles. But again, we're just trying to recreate those life cycle methods within a functional component. So to do that, we need to use state, which can kind of handle all three, but it gets a little dicey in kind of how to specifically do what you want to do. The last thing we talked about is component will unmount. This is where you need to return a function that will execute logic for you. So here we're returning an anonymous function. We're going to call our cleanup method when this component dies or is about to die. So here with an empty array and a return of a function, this is in here, this cleanup is what your component will unmount would do in a class-based component. So again, empty dependency array and returning a function that will call some logic, that is your component will unmount in a functional sense. All right, again, I know this is a lot to take in. It's going to require some practice. Let's go to our code and kind of try to do this together just to have some example of this. So I'm going to go back to my something component, and I'm going to convert this to a functional component. So again, we have a class-based component. Let's get practice. Again, you don't have to do this very often, but use effects, it's kind of hard to understand right now. So let's try to convert these methods, these lifecycle methods, to use effect. So to do this, I'm going to convert this all to a function-based component. So if we remember our steps, first thing I want to do is change class to a function. We're no longer going to extend components because that is not something we do with functional-based components. So I'm going to get rid of that. All right, so I changed my header to be a function. State values, take a different construct here. We don't create an object. Instead, we need to use that use state hook that we hopefully are familiar with at this point. So in this case, I'll create donuts as my state value, and then a set donuts updater function. I'm going to use state and initial value, I guess empty string is what I'm going with. So again, this is replacing my class-based component. Now I have a functional-based state value here. I need to import use state from React because I'm using it. All right, so again, we converted our state value, so we get rid of this. We'll say bye-bye for that. Constructor, there's no idea of a constructor here, but in order to take out in props for a functional-based component, those props get passed to your function as the first parameter. So in a class, your constructor's first parameter is going to be props, but for a function, your first parameter there is going to be your props. So we have access to our props now. All right, I'm going to skip our lifecycle methods ever so briefly. I'm just going to jump down to our render because that's easy to change. For a functional-based component, we do not need a method called render, so we just delete that. We keep everything else in it. So this is what we return. Oops. We're still destructuring, that works just fine. There's no this.props. The this keyword kind of disappears in our uses here, so we just do props, because props is coming from our parameter right there. Destructuring it, looks like none of this has to change. We're not using this keyword. So, all right, we changed most of this to a functional-based component. Again, pretty simple. Just gotta remember all the differences here. So this will return. That's our render item. But now the question is, how do we re-implement our lifecycle methods? So to do this, we need to use effects. So use effect will be our answer. Use effects. We need to import it. So VS Code automatically imported it for me from React, but if it does not, we need to manually do it. Again, to reiterate, use effect takes in two parameters. The first one's required. That's going to be a function. So I'm going to create an anonymous function here. The second one is optional, but usually always, you're going to always have that. So this one specifies when this use effect is going to be fired or triggered. Empty array means it'll only trigger once, and that's on the initial render. So we have a component did mount. Let me put my logic for that in here. So this is my component did mount now. Maybe I shouldn't take it all completely. All right, so these two are equivalent right now. Component did mount gets called one and only one time in a class-based component. Likewise, my use effect with an empty dependency array will only call this logic one and only one time. All right, so I'm going to check that off here. This gets a little more complicated, but let's see if we can kind of go with it. I'm going to skip this part and go to my component will unmount. So component will unmount, if we remember, it's going to copy the logic we want. This is what we return inside of a function. So I'm going to return an anonymous function, and that's going to simply print out when this component, when my something component is about to be unmounted, it's going to call this function that I'm specifying in the return value and execute whatever logic I want. So in this case, I'm just printing out component will unmount, I am dying. Okay, the hard part becomes, how do we do this stuff? The answer to that would be, you could add more use effects. You're not limited to just one use effect. So if I had a use effect, another use effect here, this one is going to print out, I am updating now because of value changing. All right, but the question is, how does React or how will my component know to execute this or this based on value changing? Well, this one is going to be only limited to the initial render, but I can specify in my dependency array right here, and I could say, hey, whenever the value of props.values change. So now I'm saying specifically when this value changes, unfortunately I use the same name of value and value, but when this variable changes, that's when this use effect is going to fire. However, there is a caveat to that if you remember from our slides. Sorry, I'm bouncing back and forth. With this construct, I have a dependency array. Component did mount, so will still kind of call this. So the first render will still call into my use effect, even though I have a dependency item. So in fact, that's going to call this for the first time because I have an empty array, but also it's going to call this, even though I have a dependency here. That's just the way use effect works. Why does it work that way? I'm not sure. There might be a good React reason behind it, but in this case, this use effect is effectively a component did mount plus component did update for value. I can copy this for other. It's going to be essentially the same. So let's get other in here. All right, so again, you can have multiple use effects. Again, there's no limit to how many you can have. So this one is the same idea, but it's for other instead. For other. And then again, we could have a third one since I introduced donuts as some value here, apparently. We could have that for our state value. So again, you could use any prop value or state value in here. So in this case, we have a state value called donuts. So donuts is a state value. So we can just use that as is. All right, so again, the problem right now is that I'm calling this on every initial render. All three of these are going to fire, but that's not what I want based on what I've console logged here. I only wanted to show this when we're updating. Value, other. Okay, so we mostly achieve this, but not quite. So how do we actually go about this? So this is when we're talking about use ref. It gets a little messy, but if we introduce, all right, so I gotta kind of wiggle my way through this. So const let my ref equal use ref. I'm not sure if I want to go down this line because it gets kind of confusing, but we should try to accomplish it. So this should be true initially. So let's call this initial render. So we're going to set that to true initially, and then we want to inspect it inside our use effects. Now, how do we do this? So if initial render dot current, again, that current is how you access the value within the ref. Again, we haven't talked about refs, but they do exist and can be useful. So if we're not in our initial render, then proceed to do this. Let's see if this actually works for us. Any questions while I'm putting this up?
Quick one, use effect, is that, sorry, not use effect, but the use ref, is that mostly only used inside the use effect hooks?
It usually is not. So this is where I'm going to point you to documentation. There are a number of hooks. So we talked about a few of them. We talked about use state. That's one we use extensively. Use effect is what we're introducing today. It's going to be also used pretty extensively. The last one that's going to be introduced, I think, on Friday is use context. So these three, definitely get familiar with these. There are a few others. So use ref is in here. There's also use memo, which I've never used. Use reducer. I'm going to have you guys read these if you guys are interested. But use ref has two use cases. One use case is to reference an element. And the second use case is, I think they talk about it here. Okay, I'm not going to scan this quickly, but what I mentioned before is use ref doesn't notify of changes. So it's like a state value, but doesn't trigger a re-render. But the way we're using use ref is one use case for using a ref. There are other use cases for ref, but I think we're getting kind of off track because, again, ref is kind of complicated. We haven't talked about it, and I fully don't understand it because I don't use it too often either. But one use case is it can retain values for you. So in this case, initial render is going to be true initially. We're going to check that to make sure we don't console log anything unless it's false. So again, I'm negating this value. So when it's false, we'll get into here. Last thing we need to do here is we want to set initial render to false. So when we do our initial render, we want to update that false. Now, the question I have, it's an open question and honest question is, what order do these use effects get called in? That might be something, let's see, what if we did, let's take a look. I don't think this is gonna work, but let's kind of see where we're at right now. So use ref. That's what I'm using there. Maintains a value that doesn't force a re-render. Right, so again, like a state value, but not a state value. So here, all right, so we're back to our lifecycle app. All right, so this is my initial state. If I hit create, let's get our property inspector back so we can see those console logs. Create. All right, so we got those additional updates. That is not what we wanted, so that's something we need to clean up. So let's ignore those for now. But we got our I am allowed now. Now, if I hit update value, notice I get I am updating now because of value changing. If I update other, oops, that's my mistake. It should be other. It should be donuts. All right, so our initial case is still broken here. So if I refresh, we get all these updating messages, which is bad. We don't want that, so we need to fix that. But aside from that, our update value, when we click that, update value, notice we get component update. I am updating because of value changing. Update other, I'm changing because of other changing. And then I guess I don't have an update for donuts. But if we did have an update to donuts by some mechanism, that would print out only this message. Because again, we are specifically triggering this use effect based on whatever value we specified in a dependency. You can have multiple dependencies in here. So if I had donuts and props.value, for example, you can have as many dependencies as you want. Only one of these needs to be modified for this use effect to change. It's not an and, it's an or. So again, if I have two dependencies for this use effect, if either one of these change, if donuts change, or if my props.value change, then I'll print out this message also. So in this case, I have props.value as a dependency. So if I go back to my code here, create, if I click other, I'm going to get only one update from the other use effect. If I click update value, that's going to trigger both this use effect and this use effect because props.value is a dependency for both of those use effects. So if I click update value, notice we get value changing and donuts changing. Okay, so again, you can have multiple dependencies for your dependency array. All right, so let me remove that. Final thing I need to figure out is how to get componented mounts to be effective here. That's a good question. So all these are firing. I don't think the order matters, so I'm gonna have to kind of fiddle with this, but while I'm trying to fiddle with this, any remaining questions on the life cycle of a component in React?
Does values, is that some specific keyword or is that just generally something that was assigned as a prop?
That was a prop. So again, I used generic items here. I should probably have been like my value. Sorry, again, I kept very generic names here. I don't know if that was better. Probably looking like it was worse, but yeah, it's specifically my prop value that I'm passing in here. So my value, gotta change these in a few places. My value. All right, so we're hitting lunchtime, so I don't want to keep you guys much longer. Let's kind of wrap this up here. Okay, interesting. So the ordering of use effect does impact it. So that is something that I guess I'm sort of discovering now, but probably should have known ahead of time. So to achieve what I want before, I'm going to put all my use effects above this one. I think that's what I'm aiming for here. So my component did mount use effect is the last one here. I think I'm going to need to read into why this matters, but now that I have it ordered this way, let's see if this cleans up what my issue was here. So create, here we go. So we only get one call there. So notice that this protected us from calling into the logic for our other use effects, because again, we're still getting into this use effect, to be clear, but we are not proceeding to do the logic here because we're protecting ourselves with this initial render ref here. So again, now we've achieved just the component update. Component mounts has disappeared from our logic. I know that's a little confusing, and use effects just is confusing, a little more confusing than class-based components. But now I should have my functionality back restored. So I create, update, update other, update value, delete. We got I am dying now because I moved that component from like
Anchor, was it because you were setting false right at the beginning? So all the other ones were reading false and then firing, and now false is at the end for
that's
initial render.
I like that reasoning. I think that's probably, yeah, that makes sense actually. Yeah, I think that's a good lead. Again, I'm not 100% sure, but that makes sense to me now that you're saying it. This is probably going top down. So yeah. Yeah, it's a good find there, Guillermo. I want to believe that. Okay, let's wrap up our lecture here. So we did this, did that, yada, yada, yada. Okay, you can clean up for each individual state change. So if you return a function from a use effect that has a dependency, that cleanup is going to be run for every time your state updates. Again, this is a limited use case, but just know that if you have a non-empty dependency array and you return something, that's not just component did unmount, that's basically component did unmount for, or it's like state value unmounted or something. I don't know how to kind of phrase it there. So we'll pass it over. So yep, that completes our React lifecycle. Yes, we're going with the Lion King thing, so if you guys can stay with it, but component mounts, updates, and eventually unmounts. This is the circle of React components. Simba, being a smart cat, knows that because he read the documents or the docs. So lesson for you there, or I guess message for you there is read the React docs. Again, we introduce a lot of new ideas here. React docs are pretty good. They detail a lot of the things that we're talking about. So use ref if you have a question on that. The docs should kind of explain why you have a use ref. Again, these lifecycle methods. Highly encourage you to peek into all of these. Component did mount, component did update, component will unmount. Those are the big three. So click on them. Make sure you give them a good read to understand when you use them, how they react, what causes they might have within your component. All right, so docs are the answers to probably a lot of the questions you might have right now. Okie dokes, that completes our lifecycle lecture. I know that was a long one. Let me stop the recording here.